From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And here's what's coming up. K-State's Dan O'Brien considers the increasing uncertainty about the row crop harvest numbers as a result of the freezing temperatures that overspread a large part of the Midwest and Plains regions last week. That's one of Dan's main talking points during his weekly segment on the grain market trends. Following then, K-State's A.J. Tarpoff on the threat of prussic acid in crop stover and harvested feeds triggered by last week's freeze, and what you cattle producers should do to assure that your herds don't ingest stover or hay that's high in prussic acid content. Later on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp checks in. Plus much more ahead on this Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Welcome once more to another Agriculture Today. The grain market scene has no lack of fresh developments, and we will get into those once more with Dan O'Brien joining us for his weekly visit. He's a grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, normally based in Colby, northwest Kansas, but he happens to be on campus and Mike side with us right here today. Dan, good to have you by. With regard to the corn market, there are still several key production states out there where the corn output outcome is very much in doubt, and that's not likely to resolve itself anytime soon, it sounds.
Well, yes. Looking at the most recent crop progress report, again, we've got, in kind of a broken record fashion, you've got corn maturity in the three I states, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, at basically 72, 73%, and they're normally 94 or 98%. Looking at Michigan and Minnesota, you've got maturity at 44%, normally 80, 66% from Minnesota, normally 93. And then the Dakotas, we're running similarly. Wisconsin, 49%, normally 81.
And these are states that experienced at least a frost, if not a hard freeze.
Yes. You do wonder, when you have premature killing frost, such conditions as this, you'll tend towards lower test weight. That will eventually work itself out in USDA ear weight versus ear count estimates. And at a time, somewhere out there, I don't know if it'll be the November crop report. It will probably take until the January final number before we know what we have out there. And I think what happened in the most recent crop production report, and you saw it some in how the markets responded to it, again, first down, then up, and then kind of around, is that when you look at the corn market in particular, you generally have the managed money spec funds looking at the market negatively. Now, maybe, again, there's a number of analysts been thinking about this. Perhaps that has to do with the trade war, economic jitters, politics in the U.S. threatening to shake everything up. We don't know, but in general, well, we kind of know it's some combination of all that. But in general, it seems that until the USDA comes up with some hard number to verify what we have out there for corn and for soybeans, that there's not enough evidence to change the basic mindset of the grain futures markets. So even after some movement up and down, you've got closes yesterday for Dees corn to 394 and 3/4. November beans 931.5, and November beans are up, from where they were. Just moderate response. So challenging to not expect to have some light corn. And in the north, ear droppage, all sorts of problems. Right. And yet came through this most recent October USDA report and showed basically the same, 168.4 bushels per acre, up actually a little bit from where they were at. That was after a harvested acreage change. So both harvested acres and yields at risk. In fact, the USDA announced here this week that in the November crop production report, they're going to resurvey Minnesota and North Dakota again to see what percent of harvested acres are actually going to have occur.
They may have to shovel snow to get to the fields.
And that's not just hyperbole.
Right.
You know, what's going to be left? And so we've talked about how the futures have this bearish bias in the spec funds until proven otherwise, until we get hard numbers that would shake that perception and direction in the market. But it sure bears watching on the basis side. When you look at basis bids at ethanol plants all the way through the United States, Western Iowa, 15. It ranges from 2,500 to 15 over. Illinois, basically I'll give the top side bids, narrowest basis bids. Illinois, 12 over Dees, and again Western Iowa, 15 over, 40 over. Dees in Indiana, 50 over in Ohio, 40 over in Michigan, Kansas 35 over the best bid, Minnesota level basis, Nebraska 15 over, Wisconsin 5 over, South Dakota 9 over. Even grain sorghum bids at ethanol plants reported to range in Kansas from 30 under Ds to 15 under, which is very, very healthy, very good relative to what we're seeing in general for grain sorghum basis bids in other, in our normal markets. So the point is that I know what the futures are doing. They need evidence. Also, we have some perception of what users are doing, and they're bidding up. So it kind of puts us in a situation, I think, that we're seeing this for corn, and maybe this might hold up for beans too if we get damage like could happen from what's occurred here. Grain producers will either store in town, they'll store on the farm, and they'll wonder what to do. And they're looking at the same set of factors. Do they? I guess I wonder if we have good basis bids, it might be a year to consider basis contracts. Mm-hmm. If someone will give us a good basis bid, heavens, even a forward contract bid, if it has that good basis in the middle of it, and then we walk over and start looking at buying call options that could protect us from losing out on opportunities for upward price moves after the first of the year.
The soybean market, Dan, wants to put stock in that Chinese agreement, the phase one, if you will, as it's been talked about, should it come to pass. But it's not in writing yet. It's not hard and fast. So there is this hesitancy, it appears, in the bean trade to react.
I think that we're becoming Missourians, in that the possibility of a positive agreement surely responded to well by soybean producers and the U.S. soybean industry. And China has been active coming into these talks in terms of purchases. And actually, we're looking at November beans of 931, and there's not an 8 in front of it. So we have had some support show up. But I think given the up and down nature of these negotiations, it seems that basically until the ships show up, will we see a lot of response until there's actual hard evidence of all this going forward? Yeah. Still, I don't think we, in being objective, we shouldn't be just terribly negative either, because there are hard negotiations going on. And here what's happened of late is more of an agreement on a phase one, and with further phases to come down the line between the U.S. administration and China. And frankly, if there's a piecemeal stair-step approach that could be taken that could give more positive, I guess, credence to progress going on there, well, that would seem to hold out more hope from here in ag country than an all-or-nothing brinksmanship to where you've got to swallow the whole thing, in terms of the whole agreement before anything goes forward. So maybe that's a positive.
But beyond that, we're still back to production issues and concerns because of the harvest delay, because of stands that are short of maturity, again, with the colder weather moving in. So same scenario in many respects as with corn.
We are wrestling with wondering where the soybean market's going. We in Kansas have gotten into a situation where in the western part of the state, we have horribly wide soybean bases. When you look at the Thursday USDA report for the western part of the state, basis bids run from $1.15 to $1.35 under. In the central part of the state, narrower basis bids, the best ones about 65 under, but a lot of them 80, 90, whatever. And I don't think that's the fault of any elevator or broker in Kansas. That's just how this soybean transportation system is working right now. It would be really nice to see how strong exports would shock that system and affect basis bids for soybeans here in Kansas.
The potential is there.
Potential is there, but it seems these other trade agreements and other issues need to be arrived at before you can really know what's happening there.
Well, we won't let you go without talking a brief moment about wheat, which saw a nice pop upward, a good lot of that having to do with short numbers in the soft wheat category.
Yes, the soft red winter wheat ending stocks numbers have narrowed up over the last several years. I believe I've understood there's at least a consideration of bringing soft red winter wheat here into the U.S. to meet domestic needs. So Chicago wheat went up 12 cents yesterday. Kansas City wheat, heading along the same lines, went up about 6. When you look at hard red spring wheat, it was up about 1.5 cents. So the big problems for the last part of harvest, especially in North Dakota and Montana, 10-15% of the crop remaining still out there, according to the NASS crop surveys. Those problems probably have already been digested or taken in by the hard red spring wheat futures market. And now you've got this issue in soft red winter that's come into play and bolstered futures.
So does this constitute a pricing opportunity for those still holding old crop from this past summer?
Well, a 6-cent move higher is great. You know, if it was like a 30 or 40-cent move higher, that would be even better.
Right.
But we're so export-oriented that we kept kind of waiting for the next big thing to come along, a major crop shortfall, and we have that in Australia, but enough ongoing strength in the Black Sea region and some of these other places that we haven't seen the market tighten up enough that other buyers come charging to the U.S. shores and really bolster our exports. What we said on soybeans is just ditto for wheat. We're really in need of a strong export showing to adjust these ending stocks, get something below 50% stocks to use down to 30 or 40, and then we'd see a different price situation in wheat.
Glad to have you by, and we'll talk again next week. Many thanks, Dad.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
In studio with us to go over some of the latest developments in the grain trades, that's K-State Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien. Agriculture Today returns in a moment on the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today returns now. This next segment for you cattle producers with intentions of turning your herds out on milo stalks or perhaps forages such as sorghum sudan as grazing resources. Now, those are great nutritionally, but they can also hold a major health concern and danger for your cattle in the form of prussic acid. Along with us once more is beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff, K-State Research and Extension, to cover this topic with us. It's hardly anything new, A.J., but with the freezing temperatures that we had recently, the prospect of prussic acid being out there is heightened considerably.
It really does. So prussic acid, we have certain species. You mentioned sorghum sudan, some of our milo stalks, Johnson grass. There are some of these species that actually harbor this prussic acid, but it's bound on a cellular level inside the leaves of these plants. Now, when we get some stressors that happen onto that plant, and almost happens every year, with a frost, okay? When we have that freezing, we actually we burst some of these plant cells, and it releases this prussic acid. Now, when animals consume this, what happens in the rumen is it turns into hydrogen cyanide, okay? So it's cyanide toxicity.
Bad stuff.
So it is very bad stuff. It is very toxic to cattle, especially ruminants. So what do we do? That's really what we're going to talk about today.
Distinguishing, though, importantly, as we get into this, prussic acid from another toxicity concern out there some years, nitrate toxicity.
Correct. So that's one thing I want to discuss is nitrate toxicity and prussic acid. They are two completely separate syndromes that occur in cattle. Okay. Now, where it gets confused is they're also mentioned in the same breath, so to speak, sometimes. Where nitrates, yes, it interferes with the body's ability to carry blood. Prussic acid actually interferes with the cells within the body to utilize oxygen. So the clinical signs remain the same. The animals they don't get enough oxygen. But the mechanism of which that happens inside the body is very, very different. So nitrate toxicity, again, coming off of drought-stressed plants, things of that nature. We can see similar things with prussic acid from some of the drought stress, but thankfully we don't have that issue here in Kansas this year. But in years past, we can still see some of the prussic acid issues in those same stress plants that we see nitrates, but they're very, very different.
AJ, as the prussic acid scenario plays out, does it tend to be field-wide? Does it tend to be in spots? What's the nature of it?
Okay, so if it's one of these plant species that inherently carry some of it, a lot of it comes down to the frost. Okay, do we have an equal covering of a killing frost throughout the entire field? Sometimes not. So we can have patchy or regionalized issues with prussic acid, depending on temperatures. Okay, depending on how much plant damage and cellular frost that we got down in those plants, on really what the major risk is. Okay, so it can be a little bit variable, but one thing's for sure is we know the species. And also what runs into an issue is resprouting. Yeah. Okay, we've had these patchy frost areas, and some of it killing, some of it not so much around Kansas. But what we're running into is we have some very nice days. We have warmer temperatures, we have plenty of moisture, we have sunlight.
Like we have this week.
And we can have resprouting. Now, those fresh sprouts coming off the top of a milo stalk, they can be dangerously high in prussic acid. So one thing is, as a point of caution, is turning cattle out into some of our cut milo stalks where we still have the ability to regenerate and regrow without that true killing last frost. We can run into some pretty dangerous issues and ultimately cattle death.
What should a cattle producer watch for in as far as clinical signs in the herd, suggesting that those prussic acid levels might be hot?
Okay, so once these animals, it doesn't take very much for them to consume. But once they get that critical level within their blood and within their body, they can actually die within 20 minutes of consumption. Oh. So this is a fast-acting disease. So if you can almost play it out in your head, you turn cattle out, they are starting to graze, they're hungry, they go out and graze voraciously, and all of a sudden cattle start dropping over, literally dead as you're watching them. If you do catch animals that are still, that have not fallen over, so to speak, that they'll be in respiratory distress, they may get excitable. So just like several other diseases, if they don't get enough oxygen, they can be erratic. So we can see some of that behavior, increased respiratory rate. They're trying to get oxygen, but their body just can't use it.
So it's about preventative management by and large, is it not, AJ?
It's all about prevention. Understanding the risks. When is it best for us to turn out? When is it best to harvest? When is it best to graze some of these plant species? And really, when are we safe? So how long does it take after a killing frost, a true killing frost? And I'm not talking about the resprouting, because the resprouts, once those get killed by a killing freeze and they start to wilt over. Thankfully, prussic acid, it's a vapor. Okay, so it hangs out inside the leaves of the plant for only so long, and then they dissipate into the atmosphere. So that's a good thing, but it takes a little bit of time. Okay, so after that killing frost, the first 24 hours, that's kind of our biggest danger threat is within that first 24 hours after a killing frost. Now, over about a week, 5 to 7 days, if we wait 5 to 7 days before we turn cattle out after that last killing frost that has wilted those plants, then we're deemed safe. Okay, that really takes away a lot of the risk. The same goes if we are cutting for hay. Okay, sun curing hay, drying, the proper curing, all of which helps dissipate that into the environment, and we don't have near as much risk on our animals. Same goes for ensiling. So if we're cutting for silage, if we're chopping, any of which, ultimately, if we can wait until a little bit later after the frost before we start chopping and putting things up, it takes away that risk even more. All of these things are great management tools that we can decrease the risk in our herds.
And to further reassure what's happening out there, testing your standing Milo Stover or your sorghum Sudan, whatever it might be, for the levels of prussic acid in it wouldn't hurt either.
Oh, absolutely. So testing is available at a number of different labs all over the place. Work with your local extension office. Ask these questions about prussic acid, especially if you're concerned. If you've had maybe a mild frost, don't know if it's actually killed the plant, and if you want to get some testing done just to see the level or not, it's a good idea to err on the safe side. So there is testing available. Now, the testing, we need to be pretty prompt with our testing because, as I alluded to, that prussic acid and hydrogen cyanide, it dissipates pretty rapidly. And it absorbs back into the atmosphere. So proper testing, work with your extension office, other nutritionists. They'll be able to give you some really good tips on how to properly sample, how to properly enclose, which is usually a Ziploc bag. We want to retain the moisture of that sample and then get it sent into the lab pretty rapidly. Now, once you get results back, so the levels of toxicity, what is safe, what is not safe, a few good rules of thumb is if they measured it on an as-is basis, all the moisture included, we're looking at about 200 parts per million. So 200 parts per million, anything higher than that would be deemed toxic. And on a dry matter basis, it would be considered about 500 parts per million. Okay, so whenever you get your results back, make sure you understand whether it is dry matter or as-is basis, because we do have a different level that would be deemed toxic.
Why are we talking about testing, about preventative approaches? The treatment measures for prussic acid poisoning are very, very limited, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, it is limited, and we are limited in some of that emergency, antidote, so to speak. So if you read any literature, if you pick up any publication that discusses prussic acid, there'll be some antidotes that are often mentioned. They can be sodium nitrite, can be sodium thiosulfate. So there's a couple of these things that are mentioned here and there, but unfortunately, these all have to be compounded. These are not products that your veterinarian can keep in bulk or on stock. So while it's happening to these animals every 20 minutes, they could be affected. It could take a week plus to get some of this product made to work as an antidote.
It's impractical.
It is very impractical to have that in the time that's needed to actually make a difference on these animals. So what we do is if there's a case, if we have cases, if we've recently turned out cattle, we want to make sure we pull them off of that forage base as quickly as possible. Now, if they've lived about 2 hours after exposure, usually they can dissipate some of that toxin, okay? They can get rid of some of that. So if they've lived past that initial insult, they usually go on to do just fine. And one last little tip that can really help us go, this is a very similar tip that what we do for higher nitrate feeds, that we run into nitrate toxicity, but this is something we can also do whenever we're turning cattle out if there's a little bit of risk for prussic acid, and that's feeding our animals before we turn them out into fresh forage, okay?
Well, that'll help buffer the danger, if you will?
It will help buffer some of that. So whether we've fed some good quality hay prior to turning them out, we just don't want very aggressive eating cattle going out into some of these fresh areas where they could overconsume, unfortunately. So it's always a good tip that we never want to turn those cattle out when they're very hungry. We can fill them up before we turn them out to help dissipate some of that risk.
Well, it's good advice all on avoiding prussic acid poisoning conditions in your cattle herd as you would utilize that Milo Stover again, or once more if you intend to graze sorghum Sudan or other like feedstuffs which can harbor prussic acid after the first freezing temperatures of the season, which we have had now over most of Kansas. AJ, greatly appreciate the information. Many thanks.
It's always a pleasure.
He is beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff, K-State Research and Extension. And Agriculture Today returns in a few moments with more on the K-State Radio Network.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you. To today's agricultural news headlines for you now, courtesy in part of DTN. Far fewer USDA employees than officials had expected are moving to Kansas City as part of that relocation announced back in June. However, USDA official Scott Hutchins said yesterday that he's confident those positions will be filled and the talent will be replaced. The government announced this past summer it would relocate 2 research agencies out of D.C. Since then, a number of USDA employees with the Economic Research Service and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture have in fact moved to Kansas City. The move created worries, including whether employees would refuse to move, leading to a loss of talent that would affect government programs for producers. Now, the House Agriculture Committee's Biotechnology, Horticulture, and Research Subcommittee is holding hearings this week to examine the USDA's efforts to implement the Farm Bill. The comments were made during that hearing. As the Deputy Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics, Hutchins told the subcommittee the number of relocated employees was far short of target, but that the agencies are finding interest in the resulting open positions. He said that efforts are well underway to fill those positions. Following the announcement, it was expected that more than 500 NIFA and ERS jobs would move from D.C. to Kansas City. The number of employees making the move, however, far fewer than the targeted September the 30th employee deadline to make the move. Hutchins told the subcommittee that the USDA has received 400 to 500 applications for open positions in Kansas City. Progress continues in developing a new national animal vaccine bank to prevent threats to our nation's livestock. Here's an update on that from the USDA's Rod Bain.
I think the animal disease prevention and preparedness provisions are one of the most important provisions that was included in the Farm Bill.
And Thursday, before the Senate Agriculture Committee, USDA Deputy Secretary Stephen Sensky noted implementation of this Farm Bill issued program continues, including creation of a national animal vaccine and veterinary countermeasures bank to protect against outbreaks of animal disease such as foot and mouth disease.
The department issued a sources sought notice to the vaccine manufacturers to get information about the various vaccines that they have available for what serotypes, the amounts that they have available. That information just closed on October 10th.
The Deputy Secretary says a procurement plan is being developed for needed vaccines and stockpiles of such.
We look forward to going out and starting that request for proposals for the acquisition of those serotypes toward the end of the year or the beginning of the next calendar year.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And one of the largest crop protection companies announced a climatic change challenge grant this week at the World Food Prize meeting in Des Moines, while a global research group launched an initiative to accelerate plant breeding programs for producers as well. The World Food Prize kicked off the annual Borlaug Dialogue, named for Norman Borlaug, of course the plant breeder dubbed the father of the Green Revolution. The administrator, that is, for the U.S. Agency for International Development, Mark Green, made multiple announcements at that dialogue, including a $70 million initiative calling for businesses and NGOs to offer the best ideas using biotechnology solutions to help smallholder farmers cope with pests, diseases, drought, and depleted soils. One of such announcements was important to K-State. More on that in a moment. And the CEO of Corteva Agriscience, James Collins, also said that his company is looking for solutions and that Corteva will be putting up $500,000 in funds to create the Corteva Agriscience Climate Positive Challenge that will be offering challenge grants to farmers who are using climate positive practices. Now, scientists here at Kansas State University will be joining peers at 2 other major research universities and the USDA to accelerate crop improvement in several key countries around the world. This will be funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development's Feed the Future initiative, which is already well represented at K-State. Marcia Boswell has more on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
Kansas State University is a partner on an international team that includes U.S. universities and national institutes in a new global crop improvement research program to advance plant breeding tools, technologies, and methods aimed at delivering crops that can increase yields, enhance nutrition, and have greater resistance to pests and diseases. The work will be through the new Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Crop Improvement. The Innovation Lab will create an integrated research and delivery program with multidisciplinary expertise in advanced agricultural development, from plant breeding and machine learning to quantitative genetics and gender inclusion. The project will support and empower national breeding programs in East and West Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, and serve as a model for introducing advanced agricultural technologies at scale to countries around the world. The 5-year, $25 million grant from the U.S. Agency for International Development as part of the U.S. government's Feed the Future initiative was announced October 16th at the World Food Prize in Des Moines, Iowa. Experts from Cornell University, Clemson University, and Kansas State University, along with scientists at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, will initially collaborate with national agricultural institutions in Ghana, Haiti, Nepal, Senegal, and Uganda to accelerate the breeding of locally and regionally adapted crop varieties targeted to smallholder farms. Kansas State University's Jesse Poland, Associate Professor of Plant Pathology, will serve as one of the new lab's Phenomics Program leads, and Jeff Morris, Associate Professor of Agronomy, will serve as the lab's Trait Discovery Program lead. Poland says the improvement of crop varieties is happening at a rate of about 1% per year around the world. This is good progress, but we need to see a rate of gain above 2% per year to keep pace with increasing global population demand. He said, here at K-State, we will be partnering with national programs to help implement rigorous scientific inquiry to address the constraints of crop productivity. Currently, plant breeders at national agricultural research institutions develop locally adopted crops using breeding lines first created by scientists in that country and in coordination with the International Coalition of Food Security Research Programs, known as the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research Centers. Along with its partnership in the Innovation Lab for Crop Improvement, Kansas State University is home to 4 Feed the Future Innovation Labs: the Innovation Lab for Applied Wheat Genomics, Innovation Lab for Collaborative Research on Sorghum and Millet, Innovation Lab for Reduction of Post-Harvest Loss, and Innovation Lab for Sustainable Intensification. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia, and we'll be back shortly. This is Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Next up for you on Agriculture Today, Kansas agricultural weather, and the very latest from the Weather Data Library here at Kansas State University. Across the way, as always on a Friday, is Mary Knapp, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension, and we just ran through, Mary, an ideal week for field work in Kansas.
Right. It was a fairly nice week. It was slightly cooler than normal, despite if we look back to Friday of last week, where we went from a 92 at a high out in southwestern Kansas to a 14 for a low in that same division of that vigorous cold front coming through. We were about 6 degrees cooler than normal statewide. the big thing for field work is that it was dry, and that has been welcome in the eastern third of the state where we have still excess moisture to deal with. Not quite so welcome in the west where really they could use some rainfall. The situation is getting drier. We've had an expansion of the abnormally dry conditions, an expansion of the moderate drought, and we had an introduction of the D2 or severe drought in areas that have gone for since the start of September as drier than normal.
So it's getting quite serious for those areas. And in fact, the dryness has spread into parts of central Kansas as well.
Right. Again, an area that did not see a whole lot of moisture in the September-October period. Better than the west. It's still running at 82% of normal for that September to October 15th time period. But that's also an area that has a lot more sandy soils in it, and those tend to dry out, particularly on the surface, much faster than other soils will do. And it is a critical time for that fall planting, winter wheat, canola in particular. We need to have some of that surface moisture to get that crop started in a timely manner.
We'll talk of the prospects for that in just a second. Backing up a bit, did that freeze last week, which roared through Kansas the latter part of the week, did it reach all of Kansas?
Right. It did reach all of Kansas. Even southeast Kansas had some places that recorded temperatures as low as 27 degrees. East Central, a little bit milder, but it was still down in the 28-degree range. Not every location in those divisions saw temperatures quite that cold, but it was cold enough to basically call an end to the growing season for our fall harvested crops, and that is going to be a concern. There was a lot of the sorghum and soybeans that were not finished, and that is going to be an issue.
Are our soil temperatures holding up in the aftermath of that?
Soil temperatures are not dropping nearly so quickly as the air temperatures did, even up in the northwest Kansas where they had 24 hours below freezing, in some places 8 to 10 hours below 24. Soil temperatures still stayed above freezing, and that is good news for that winter wheat. It's giving it a better time to harden out before we get into the true winter conditions. But it was very cold. We are seeing decreasing soil temperatures, which will be useful when we're talking about, again, planting the fall seeded crops and also any fertilizer applications that might want to be completed during the fall season.
Well, what's ahead? Later today, a front is expected to move through Kansas, and with it, the chances of rain will pick up. Here and there, though.
Right. The best chances for rain with that front are going to be in the eastern third of the state. When you look at the west, it's going to be more a matter of a shift in wind direction and some pretty strong winds that are going to increase the fire danger out in that region. In the eastern part of the state, we're going to tap into some of that Gulf moisture, and it is likely to produce a little bit more chance for precipitation, but not particularly heavy amounts. If you look at the quantitative precip forecast for the week ending next Friday, and this is basically the best chance for rain.
This is the event.
This is the event.
Yeah.
We're looking at generally a tenth to a quarter of an inch along the Flint Hills. You get into eastern Kansas, it may be as much as a half an inch, and you have to go down to extreme southeastern Kansas to get up to 3/4 of an inch. Go west of Salina, and the chances are more in the neighborhood of a hundredth to a tenth of an inch, and you get into southwest Kansas, and it's basically the amounts are traced to maybe a hundredth of an inch. Not particularly productive in those areas.
And you're saying once that system moves through, it's going to be another open week for the most part.
Right. The Weather Service forecasts are basically dry. If we look at the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14-day outlook, both of those call for an increased chance of below normal precipitation for those periods, and we don't typically see a lot of moisture as we move out of October into November. The temperature pattern is expected to favor the cooler than normal pattern that we've seen in the last couple of weeks. So cool and dry is basically the outlook for the next 10 to 14 days.
So for those areas, Mary, that have been parched or close to that since September, are needing a rain, a good round of relief may not be forthcoming for a while.
It may be a couple of weeks before we have any chance for significant moisture, and that can change. There is a tropical system developing in the Gulf of Mexico. If that would swing a little bit further west than the current projections, that could bring some moisture into the area. We'll also be watching the eastern Pacific because some frontal systems are developing there, and that can feed moisture into the area. But at this point, it's not very encouraging. One of the concerns is going to be that because it was wet during the summer, vegetative growth has been fairly productive out in that area. That means with these drier conditions, the strong winds that are coming with these fronts, fire danger is also increasing.
That's likely a topic we'll be revisiting. And we do appreciate you coming over, Mary. Many thanks.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. That is our time for today and the week. Our thanks, as always, to you as well for being along with us. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.